Identity and access management threats focus directly on credentials, tokens, and the workflows that verify identity, because those elements are the shortest path to control. Rather than exploiting obscure software flaws, attackers often target authentication itself, knowing that valid identity is trusted almost everywhere. When identity systems are abused, access looks legitimate. Logs show successful authentication, and traditional perimeter defenses are bypassed entirely. These threats are attractive because they scale well and often require little technical sophistication once initial access is obtained. Understanding how identity attacks work is therefore essential to defending modern environments, where identity is the primary security boundary. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to the CISS books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. Replay attacks occur when an attacker captures authentication messages or session tokens and reuses them to gain access without knowing the underlying secret. In these attacks, the attacker does not need to crack passwords or defeat cryptography. They simply resend previously valid material. Session cookies, bearer tokens, and some authentication exchanges are particularly vulnerable if they are not bound to freshness or context. Replay attacks are dangerous because they can succeed even against strong passwords and multi-factor authentication if tokens are stolen after authentication completes. The effectiveness of replay depends on how long captured material remains valid and whether the system can distinguish old messages from new ones. This makes replay primarily a lifecycle and protocol design problem rather than a brute force attack. Nonces and timestamps are common defenses against replay because they ensure that authentication material is fresh and cannot be reused indefinitely. A nonce is a value used once, included in an authentication exchange so that responses are valid only for that specific interaction. Timestamps limit how long a message is considered valid, narrowing the window in which captured material can be replayed. Together, these mechanisms allow systems to detect when an authentication attempt is stale or duplicated. Their effectiveness depends on proper implementation and reliable time synchronization across systems. When freshness checks are absent or poorly enforced, replay attacks become trivial even in otherwise well-designed authentication schemes. Pass-the-hash attacks target environments where password hashes can be reused as proof of identity without needing the original plain-text password. Instead of cracking the hash, the attacker presents it directly to authenticate to other systems that accept the hash as valid. This technique exploits the fact that some authentication protocols treat possession of the hash as equivalent to knowledge of the password. Once an attacker obtains a hash from one system, they may be able to authenticate to others without additional effort. This makes hash theft particularly dangerous in environments where credentials are reused implicitly across systems. Pass-the-hash attacks highlight the risk of treating derived secrets as interchangeable with original credentials. Lateral movement accelerates dramatically when hashes, tickets, or tokens are reusable across multiple systems. After compromising one host, an attacker can extract credential material and use it to access additional systems, expanding their foothold quickly. This reuse turns a single compromise into a network-wide problem, especially in flat or poorly segmented environments. Authentication mechanisms that allow credentials to be replayed across hosts inadvertently enable this movement. Defenders often underestimate how quickly attackers can pivot once reusable credentials are available.
Limiting credential reuse and scoping authentication artifacts to specific contexts are critical to slowing lateral movement. Credential stuffing attacks rely on leaked username and password pairs obtained from unrelated breaches, testing them against other services at scale. Because many users reuse passwords, attackers can achieve high success rates without guessing or cracking anything. These attacks are highly automated and can be launched with minimal cost, making them a persistent threat to any public-facing authentication endpoint. Credential stuffing does not exploit a flaw in the target system itself. It exploits human behavior and password reuse. This makes traditional patching ineffective as a defense. Preventing stuffing requires controls that assume credentials will be exposed elsewhere and compensate accordingly. Password spraying is a related technique that attempts a small number of common passwords across many accounts rather than many passwords against one account. This approach avoids triggering lockout controls that focus on repeated failures for a single user. By spreading attempts thinly, attackers can test widely used passwords with relatively low noise. Password spraying is effective in environments where password policies allow predictable or default choices. Because each account sees only a few failures, the activity can blend into background noise if monitoring is weak. Detecting spraying requires correlation across accounts rather than focusing on individual login failures. Multi-factor authentication significantly reduces the success rate of many identity attacks, but it is not immune to bypass when implemented poorly. If attackers can steal session tokens after multi-factor authentication completes, replay and session hijacking attacks remain possible. Weak enrollment or recovery processes can allow attackers to register their own factors or reset access without satisfying intended checks. Some forms of multi-factor authentication are also vulnerable to social engineering, such as users approving unexpected push prompts. Multi-factor authentication is a strong control, but only when the entire authentication lifecycle is protected. Treating it as a silver bullet ignores the ways attackers adapt. Phishing remains one of the most effective techniques for capturing credentials and tokens by impersonating trusted login pages or workflows. Modern phishing kits can proxy authentication sessions in real time, capturing passwords and session tokens even when multi-factor authentication is used. These attacks succeed by exploiting user trust rather than technical flaws, making them difficult to eliminate entirely. Phishing undermines identity systems by turning the user into an unwitting participant in the attack. Defenses focus on reducing credential reuse, strengthening authentication methods, and detecting abnormal authentication behavior rather than assuming users will never be deceived. Phishing illustrates why identity threats are as much about psychology as cryptography. Session hijacking occurs when attackers steal cookies or tokens that represent an active, authenticated session and use them to assume the victim's identity. This can happen through malware, cross-site scripting, unsecured networks, or access to shared devices. Once a session is hijacked, the attacker operates within the bounds of legitimate access until the session expires or is revoked. Session hijacking bypasses authentication controls entirely, making session management and token protection critical. Short lifetimes, binding tokens to devices, and monitoring for unusual session behavior help reduce this risk. Many real-world compromises rely on session hijacking rather than password theft.
Privileged account compromise has an outsized impact because these accounts have broad permissions that allow rapid escalation and persistence. When attackers obtain privileged credentials or tokens, they can disable controls, create new accounts, and obscure their tracks. Identity threats targeting privileged accounts therefore represent a disproportionate risk to the organization. Controls such as stronger authentication, just-in-time access, and session monitoring are especially important for these identities.
Monitoring privileged activity closely helps detect misuse early, but prevention is critical because remediation after full compromise is costly.
Protecting privileged identity paths is one of the highest priorities in identity security.
Monitoring is essential for identifying identity-based attacks because many of these threats appear as successful logins rather than failures. Unusual sign-in patterns, such as impossible travel, unfamiliar devices, or abnormal access times, provide valuable signals. Correlating authentication events across accounts helps detect spraying and stuffing that would otherwise appear benign in isolation. Monitoring also supports rapid response by identifying which credentials or sessions may be compromised. Without strong monitoring, identity attacks can persist undetected for long periods because they blend into normal access patterns. Visibility turns identity from a blind spot into a detectable control surface. Rate limiting and anomaly detection controls reduce the effectiveness of high-volume credential abuse by slowing attackers and raising detection thresholds. Rate limiting restricts how many authentication attempts can occur in a given time window, increasing the cost of automated attacks. Anomaly detection looks for deviations from typical behavior rather than relying solely on fixed thresholds. These controls are particularly effective against credential stuffing and spraying when applied consistently across authentication endpoints. They also provide valuable telemetry for security teams investigating suspicious activity. While they do not eliminate identity threats, they significantly reduce attack scalability. Identity and access management threats exploit reuse, interception, and weaknesses in verification rather than breaking cryptography outright. Replay attacks, pass-the-hash techniques, and credential stuffing all succeed by reusing valid material in unintended ways. Session hijacking and phishing shift the attack focus from secrets to tokens and user behavior. Privileged account compromise magnifies impact because of broad permissions and control. Defending against these threats requires layered controls that protect credentials, tokens, and sessions throughout their lifecycle. When identity workflows are designed with reuse and interception in mind, attackers are forced into noisier and more detectable paths. Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.